In August 2004, 27 college students and staff members arrived at Riverside Environmental Studies Center in northern Minnesota for what should have been the final week of their summer research program. None of them ever came home. The official report blamed a tragic boating accident during an unauthorized late-night excursion across the lake. The center was permanently closed, insurance settlements were paid to the grieving families, and the community moved on from its tragedy. But 18 years later, when a severe drought dropped the lake's water level to historic lows, a local fisherman made a discovery that would shatter everything the families had been told. There was no boating accident. There were no strong currents. And the 27 people who disappeared that night had been murdered to cover up something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Frank Morrison had been fishing Lake Riverside for 40 years, but he'd never seen the water level this low. The severe drought of 2022 had dropped the lake nearly 30 feet, exposing mudflats and debris that hadn't seen sunlight since the 1980s. What caught his attention wasn't the rusted shopping carts or old tires that always turned up when reservoirs drained. It was the concrete structure jutting up from the muddy lake bed like a broken tooth. Frank waded out to investigate, his boots squelching in the thick mud. The concrete was old, weathered, but definitely man-made. As he cleared away sediment and algae, he could make out what looked like a foundation. But a foundation for what? This part of the lake had been nothing but forest when it was created in 1987. Then he saw the bones. Human bones, partially buried in the mud near the concrete structure. Not one skeleton, but many. Small bones that could only belong to children. Frank called 911 with shaking hands. By evening, the lake bed swarmed with investigators. Sheriff Tom Bradley had cordoned off the area while forensic teams carefully excavated what was clearly a mass grave. 27 sets of remains, Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the county coroner, reported after 6 hours of painstaking work. 23 juveniles and 4 adults, all showing signs of trauma. Sheriff Bradley stared at the concrete foundation rising from the mud. What is this structure? Some kind of building foundation. But according to county records, this area was forested when the lake was created. There shouldn't be any structures here. Bradley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. 27 bodies. 27 people who had supposedly drowned in a boating accident 18 years ago. But here they were, buried together near a building that wasn't supposed to exist. Dr. Santos. What kind of trauma are we talking about? The coroner's expression was grim. Gunshot wounds. Multiple victims show evidence of execution-style killings. Emma Hartwell was grading environmental science exams in her Minneapolis apartment when the phone rang. As one of only 3 survivors from the Riverside Environmental Studies Center, she'd spent 18 years trying to forget that terrible night in August 2004. Emma, this is Sheriff Tom Bradley from Clearwater County. I think you need to get up here. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. Why? What's happened? We found them, Emma. We found the bodies. All 27 of them. The world seemed to tilt around Emma. For 18 years, she'd been told her friends had drowned in a boating accident. Their bodies had never been recovered because the lake was too deep, the currents too strong. She'd carried survivor's guilt all this time, wondering why she'd been one of only 3 children to escape that night. Where, she whispered, buried near some kind of concrete structure that was hidden under the lake. Emma, they weren't drowned, they were shot. Emma drove to Clearwater County that night, her mind racing through memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. She remembered the screaming, the gunshots, hiding in the woods with Tommy Patterson and Jake Morrison while something terrible happened at the camp. Sheriff Bradley met her at the crime scene, now lit by portable floodlights. The exposed lake bed looked like an archaeological dig, with evidence markers scattered around the concrete foundation and burial site. Emma, I need you to look at this structure. Do you recognize it? Emma stared at the concrete remains. It was roughly rectangular, maybe 30 feet by 20 feet, with what looked like the foundations for interior walls. I'm not sure. It's so degraded. According to the county planning office, there was never any building permitted in this area, but this foundation was poured sometime in the 1980s, before the lake was created. Emma tried to remember the layout of the Riverside Environmental Studies Center, the main research building, the dormitories, the dining hall, the laboratory facilities. Sheriff, I think this might have been the old equipment storage building. What equipment storage building? There was a building where they stored field research equipment, water testing gear, soil sampling tools, that kind of thing. It was kind of separate from the main center. Most of us students weren't supposed to go there without supervision. Bradley made notes. Emma, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Everything. Emma closed her eyes, forcing herself back to August 15th, 2004. We were supposed to present our final research projects that night. It was the last night of our summer program, but around 10 o'clock we heard vehicles, big trucks. Our program director told us to go to our dorm rooms and stay inside. What kind of vehicles? I don't know. I was a college sophomore, but they sounded like construction trucks or something heavy. And there were a lot of them. Emma remembered hiding in her dorm room with her roommate Casey, listening to shouting outside. Then the gunshots started. Tommy Patterson and I ran into the woods when we heard the shooting. We hid there all night. In the morning, we found Jake Morrison hiding by the lake. He said he saw men loading bodies into trucks. Bradley looked up from his notes. Bodies being loaded into trucks. That's what Jake said. But when the police found us, they told us there had been a boating accident. They said the other students had drowned and their bodies were lost in the lake. Emma, do you know why you three survived when no one else did? Emma had wondered about that for 18 years. Our dorm building was furthest from the main research center. We were closer to the woods. I think we just got lucky. But even as she said it, Emma wondered if luck had really been the only factor. Sheriff Bradley spent the next week trying to piece together what had really happened at Camp Riverside on August 15th, 2004. The original police reports told a straightforward story. 27 people had taken boats out for an unauthorized late-night swim and had drowned when the boats capsized in strong currents. But the evidence at the lakebed told a different story entirely. Sheriff, I've got preliminary ballistics results, Deputy Lisa Chen reported. All 27 victims were shot with the same weapon, a .45 caliber handgun. One shooter? That's what it looks like. And Sheriff, there's something else. The concrete foundation? It's not a maintenance building. The interior layout suggests it was some kind of laboratory or workshop. Bradley frowned. What kind of laboratory? We found evidence of chemical storage areas, drainage systems for washing equipment, and what looks like a ventilation system. This was a serious industrial facility. Bradley pulled out the original police report from 2004. The lead investigator had been Sheriff Dale Hutchkins, who had retired in 2010. The report was brief, almost cursory, describing the scene as consistent with a boating accident. Chen, run a background check on Sheriff Hutchkins. I want to know what he's been doing since retirement. The background check revealed that Dale Hutchkins had moved to Florida in 2010, just 2 years after the Camp Riverside incident. He'd purchased a $400,000 house in cash and had been living comfortably on what appeared to be a generous pension. More interesting was what Chen discovered about the camp itself. Sheriff, Camp Riverside was owned by Northwoods Recreation LLC. But get this, the LLC was controlled by a company called Midwest Development Partners, which was owned by a man named Richard Brennan. Who's Richard Brennan? Local businessman. He owned several properties in the area, including a construction company that specialized in environmental cleanup projects. Bradley felt pieces clicking together. Environmental cleanup? Hazardous waste disposal, contaminated soil remediation, that kind of thing. And Sheriff, here's where it gets interesting. Brennan's construction company had a contract with the state to clean up an old chemical plant site about 5 miles from Camp Riverside. What kind of chemical plant? Northland Plastics. They manufactured PVC products from 1968 to 1995. The site was contaminated with dioxins, heavy metals, and other toxic chemicals. When the company went bankrupt, the state took over cleanup responsibility. Bradley stared at the evidence board they'd created, trying to see the connections. So Brennan's company was cleaning up a toxic waste site, and he also owned the camp where 27 people were murdered. And the camp was built on top of what looks like an industrial facility that predates the lake creation. Chen, I think we need to talk to Richard Brennan. Richard Brennan operated his construction business from a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. When Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Chen arrived, they found Brennan in his office reviewing blueprints for what appeared to be another environmental cleanup project. Brennan was in his 60s, with gray hair and the weather-beaten appearance of someone who'd spent decades in construction. He seemed genuinely surprised to see law enforcement. Sheriff Bradley? What brings you by? Mr. Brennan, we're investigating the Riverside Environmental Studies Center incident from 2004. I understand you owned the property where the center was located. Brennan's expression grew cautious. That's right. Terrible tragedy. I closed the center permanently after the accident. Mr. Brennan, we've discovered that the victims weren't killed in a boating accident. They were murdered and buried on your property. For a moment, Brennan said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair. Sheriff, I think you've been misinformed. Those students drowned in the lake. Their bodies were never recovered because of the strong currents. We found 27 sets of remains buried near a concrete structure that predates the lake. Mr. Brennan, what was that building used for? Brennan stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the equipment yard behind his office. Sheriff, that building was part of the original property development. Nothing important. Deputy Chen consulted her notes. Mr. Brennan, your company held the state contract for cleaning up the Northland Plastics site. Were you using the center property for any activities related to that cleanup? I don't see how that's relevant to your investigation. Bradley sensed they were getting close to something Brennan didn't want to discuss. Mr. Brennan, where were you on the night of August 15th, 2004? I have no idea. That was 18 years ago. It was the night 27 people died on your property. I'd think you'd remember. Brennan returned to his desk and sat down heavily. Sheriff, I think this conversation is over. If you have specific accusations to make, you can direct them to my attorney. As they left Brennan's office, Chen shook her head. He's hiding something, but I'm not sure what. Let's find out more about that Northland Plastics cleanup. I have a feeling that's the key to this whole thing. The Northland Plastics cleanup records were stored at the State Environmental Agency in St. Paul. Deputy Chen spent 2 days reviewing thousands of pages of documents related to the contaminated site remediation. What she found was deeply disturbing. Sheriff, the Northland site was supposed to be cleaned up according to strict EPA guidelines. Contaminated soil was supposed to be excavated and transported to licensed hazardous waste facilities for proper disposal. But that's not what happened. According to these shipping manifests, Brennan's company removed over 200 tons of contaminated soil from the Northland site between 2003 and 2004. But the disposal receipts don't add up. Only about 50 tons can be accounted for at legitimate disposal facilities. Bradley studied the documents Chen had copied. So what happened to the other 150 tons? I think it was dumped illegally somewhere. And Sheriff, look at these dates. The bulk of the soil removal happened in July and August 2004, right before the camp incident. You think Brennan was dumping toxic waste on the camp property. It would explain the concrete building. That could have been a processing facility where they stored or treated contaminated materials before disposal. Bradley felt the scope of the conspiracy expanding. And if students or staff discovered what was happening, they became witnesses who needed to be eliminated. Chen pulled out more documents. Sheriff, there's something else. The center was scheduled to close permanently at the end of that summer anyway. Brennan had applied for permits to develop the property as a residential subdivision. So he needed the site to appear clean for development. Exactly. He couldn't have a bunch of witnesses talking about seeing trucks dump toxic waste where families were going to live. Bradley's phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Frank Morrison, Minneapolis PD. Sheriff Bradley? This is Detective Morrison. I understand you're investigating the Camp Riverside case. I think we need to talk. Why? Because I've been investigating Richard Brennan for 3 years. He's been running illegal waste disposal operations across Minnesota, and several people who threatened to expose him have died under suspicious circumstances. Bradley felt his pulse quicken. How many people? At least 6 that I can document. Environmental inspectors, former employees, community activists. All died in accidents or from sudden illnesses after they started asking questions about Brennan's business practices. Detective Morrison, how soon can you get here? Detective Frank Morrison arrived in Clearwater County the next day, carrying files that documented a pattern of intimidation and murder spanning nearly 2 decades. Brennan's been using his legitimate construction business as a cover for illegal waste disposal, Morrison explained to Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Chen. He underbids on cleanup contracts, then cuts corners by dumping contaminated materials in unauthorized locations. Morrison spread photographs across the conference table. These are 6 people who died after threatening to expose Brennan's operations. Sarah Martinez, EPA inspector, died in a car accident after questioning disposal manifests. Tom Wilson, former employee, died of apparent food poisoning after telling coworkers he was going to report illegal dumping. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, environmental scientist, died in a house fire after publishing a study about contaminated groundwater near one of Brennan's projects. Bradley studied the photos. All accidents or natural causes? Officially, yes, but the timing is too convenient. In every case, the victim died within weeks of making complaints about Brennan's activities. Deputy Chen leaned forward. Detective Morrison, do you think Brennan was operating at Camp Riverside in 2004? I'm certain of it. The soil contamination levels at the Northland Plastics site were so high that proper disposal would have cost millions of dollars. Brennan saved money by dumping it illegally, probably in multiple locations. Morrison pulled out a map marked with red pins. These are sites where I suspect Brennan dumped contaminated materials. The Environmental Studies Center fits the pattern perfectly. Remote location, property he controlled, easy access for trucks. And when center staff and students discovered what was happening, he eliminated them. 27 witnesses who could have destroyed his business and sent him to prison for decades. Bradley looked at the evidence they'd assembled. We've got motive, We've got opportunity. We've got a pattern of behavior. But we still need proof that Brennan personally ordered the killings. Morrison smiled grimly. That's where I think I can help. I've been working with the FBI on a federal case against Brennan. We have wiretaps, financial records, and testimony from former employees. We just needed one more piece to complete the puzzle. The Camp Riverside murders. Exactly. If we can prove Brennan ordered those killings, it establishes a pattern of violence that supports the federal charges. Chen's phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, then hung up with a grim expression. That was the coroner. Toxicology results on the Environmental Studies Center victims show high levels of dioxin and heavy metal contamination in their bone tissue. They were exposed to the same chemicals found at the Northland Plastics site. Bradley felt the final pieces falling into place. They were killed because they discovered the toxic waste dumping. Morrison nodded. And now we're going to prove it. The arrest warrant for Richard Brennan was signed on a Friday morning in October 2022. Sheriff Bradley, Deputy Chen, and Detective Morrison, along with FBI agents from the Minneapolis field office, coordinated a simultaneous raid on Brennan's construction business and his home. They found Brennan in his office, calmly shredding documents. Richard Brennan, you're under arrest for the murders of 27 people at the Riverside Environmental Studies Center on August 15, 2004. Brennan didn't resist as they handcuffed him. I want to speak to my attorney. You'll have that opportunity, but first we're going to search this entire facility for evidence of illegal waste disposal and murder. The search revealed a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, financial records showing payments to off-the-books contractors, disposal manifests with forged signatures, and most damning of all, a safe containing photographs of the Camp Riverside operation. The photos showed trucks dumping contaminated soil near the concrete building that had been exposed by the drought. Other photos showed the building itself being used as a storage and processing facility for toxic materials. The final photos, dated August 15, 2004, showed what appeared to be a cleanup operation. Men in protective suits removing equipment and evidence from the facility. These photos were taken the night of the murders, FBI agent Patricia Torres told Sheriff Bradley. They show Brennan's crew cleaning up the waste disposal operation after eliminating the witnesses. Bradley stared at the photos. 27 people had died to cover up illegal dumping of toxic waste. College students and staff who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Do we have enough for a conviction? Agent Torres nodded. Between the physical evidence, the financial records, and the testimony from survivors and former employees, this is one of the strongest cases I've seen. The trial of Richard Brennan began 6 months later and became national news. Environmental activists, victims' rights groups, and families of those killed in other toxic waste cases followed every detail of the proceedings. Emma Hartwell testified about what she had witnessed that night, describing the trucks, the gunshots, and the years of being told that her fellow students had drowned in an accident. I carried guilt for 18 years, Emma told the jury. I thought I had somehow failed to save my friends. Now I know they were murdered by someone who cared more about money than human life. Tommy Patterson and Jake Morrison, the other two survivors, provided corroborating testimony about the events of August 15, 2004. Detective Morrison presented the pattern of suspicious deaths connected to Brennan's business activities. Agent Torres walked the jury through the financial evidence showing how Brennan had profited from illegal waste disposal while cutting costs by avoiding proper disposal fees. But the most damaging testimony came from Marcus Webb, a former employee of Brennan's construction company who had agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Mr. Brennan told us the center staff and students had discovered the dumping operation. Webb testified. He said they were going to report it to the EPA, and that would shut down our business and send us all to prison. What did Mr. Brennan say needed to be done? He said the witnesses had to be eliminated, all of them. He couldn't risk anyone talking about what they'd seen. Webb described how Brennan had hired outside contractors to carry out the killings while his regular crew cleaned up the waste disposal operation. It was supposed to look like an accident. Mr. Brennan said boating accidents happened all the time at summer camps. No one would question it. Brennan's defense attorney argued that his client was being framed by disgruntled former employees and ambitious law enforcement officers. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 27 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of illegal waste disposal, and conspiracy charges. Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. After Brennan's conviction, the state launched a comprehensive investigation into toxic waste sites across Minnesota. Soil testing at the former Camp Riverside location revealed contamination levels that made the property uninhabitable for generations. The families of the Camp Riverside victims filed a massive civil lawsuit against Brennan's company and the state agencies that had failed to properly oversee the Northland Plastics cleanup. The settlement totaled $47 million. Emma Hartwell used her portion of the settlement to establish the Camp Riverside Memorial Foundation, which provides support for environmental justice cases and helps communities fight illegal waste disposal operations. Those 27 people died because someone valued profit over human life, Emma said at the foundation's launch event. We're going to make sure their deaths weren't in vain by preventing others from suffering the same fate. Detective Morrison continued investigating environmental crimes across the Midwest, working with federal agencies to prosecute companies that illegally dispose of toxic materials in poor and rural communities. Sheriff Bradley kept the photos from Brennan's safe in his office as a reminder of what could happen when law enforcement failed to ask the right questions. The original investigation in 2004 had been cursory, accepting the accident explanation without proper evidence. We failed those families for 18 years, Bradley said. We should have known that 27 people don't just disappear without a trace. Someone should have questioned the official story. The concrete foundation at the bottom of the drained lake was left as a memorial to the victims. A plaque was installed listing all 27 names and the words, "They died seeking the truth. May their truth protect others." But the case also raised disturbing questions about how many other toxic waste sites might be hidden across the country and how many other witnesses might have been silenced to protect corporate profits. Emma Hartwell thought about those questions every day as she worked with communities fighting environmental contamination. The Camp Riverside murders had been solved, but the broader problem of environmental crime continued. There are other Richard Brennans out there, she said. Other companies cutting corners, other communities being poisoned, other witnesses being intimidated. Our job is to make sure they don't get away with it. The work was dangerous. Several environmental activists had received threats after the Brennan conviction, but Emma felt she owed it to her friends who had died that night in August 2004. Casey Martinez had been her best friend at camp. She was supposed to be a teacher now, maybe married with children of her own. Instead, she was buried in a mass grave because she had seen trucks dumping toxic waste. Emma would spend the rest of her life making sure that no other children would die for witnessing environmental crimes. It was the only way to honor the memory of the 27 people who had paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some truths were worth dying for, but more importantly, some truths were worth living for, worth fighting for, worth dedicating your life to protecting. The Camp Riverside conspiracy had been exposed. Richard Brennan would die in prison. But the fight for environmental justice would continue, one case at a time, one community at a time, one truth at a time.